Good afternoon and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased you could join us for this afternoon's talk, whether you're here in the theater or joining us on Facebook or YouTube. Before we hear from today's speaker, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up soon here in the McGowan Theater. This week, from February 5th to the 9th, we'll be hosting the 16th Annual Showcase of Academy Award nominated documentaries and short subjects. From Wednesday through Sunday, we'll show the nominated films in four categories: documentary feature, documentary short subject, live action short film, and animated short. Once again, this event has proven to be very popular and most of the screenings are at capacity. However, if you'd like to be put on the wait list, please go to the National Archives Foundation website, archivesfoundation.org. Walk-ins will be admitted 15 minutes before the start time, depending upon available seats. And on Wednesday, February 12th at noon, Craig Fairman will be here to tell us about his new book, Author-in-Chief, The Untold Story of Our Presidents and the Books They Wrote, and share his insights about the presidents through their literary works. To keep informed about these and other events throughout the year, check our website, archives.gov, or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. Another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports the work of the agency, especially our education and outreach programs. And check out their website, archivesfoundation.org, to learn more about them. Even those of us who believe we have at least passing knowledge of significant events of our past can come across stories that still shock and amaze us. The events described in David Zucchino's new book make up such a story. In Wilmington's Lies, Zucchino brings a lost history to the surface. When one hears what happened in Wilmington in November 1898, the first reaction is, how did I not know about this? After disrupting an election, armed men swept through the city and killed at least 60 people. Over the next few months, more than 2,000 African Americans fled and never returned to their homes. White supremacists took over the local government, and a city that had had a burgeoning African American middle class, whose members were active participants in civic life, was changed forever. In a recent NPR interview, David Zucchino called what happened in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898 America's first and only armed overthrow of a legally elected government. He added that it was not a race riot, it was a coup, and it was premeditated. The facts of the story need no embellishment. In the New York Times, reviewer Eddie Gauld said, Zucchino's moral judgment stands at a distance. He simply describes what happened and the lies told to justify it all. In short, he calls Wilmington's Lie a brilliant new book. David Zucchino is a contributing writer for the New York Times and a former national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times. Before moving to the LA Times, he worked for 20 years at the Philadelphia Inquirer as the bureau chief in Beirut, Nairobi, and Johannesburg. He was awarded the Pulitzer Prize in Reporting for South Africa and is a four-time Pulitzer Prize finalist for coverage of Iraq, Lebanon, Africa, and inner-city Philadelphia. He's the author of the books Thunder Run and Myth of the Welfare Queen. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome David Zucchino.
Thank you, David. Thanks, everyone, for coming out. I was a little worried about the turnout today, first of all, with the nice weather, people recovering from the Super Bowl, the Iowa caucuses, and impeachment, but thank you. Here we are. I like to start out talks usually by asking people in the audience how many of you had ever heard about the events in this book before you came across the book. Quite a few. That's great. Educated audience. Usually when I go around, particularly around the country, I can't find anyone who's ever heard of it. Even in North Carolina, I can't find people who've heard of it. And I have to admit, I had never heard of this until about 20 years ago. And I went to high school and college in North Carolina and never heard once from a professor or a teacher about this event, and certainly didn't read it in the history books. I was a freshman many, many years ago at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and I was assigned to a dorm called Morrison Dorm. I had no idea who Morrison was. Somebody said he was a governor. Years later, as I'm researching this book, I find out he's a character in the book. He was one of the leading speakers during the white supremacy campaign of 1898 that led up to the coup and the massacre. When I went to football games on campus, I went to Kenan Stadium. Again, I didn't really know or care who Kenan was. While I'm researching this book, I find out he was William Buck Kenan. He was the commander of a gun crew that went through the city on the day of the coup, shooting down black men. When I graduated from journalism school, my first job was at the News and Observer newspaper, which is in the capital city in Raleigh. And it was founded by a man named Josephus Daniels. And while I worked at the paper, there were all these tributes to Josephus in the newsroom as this great journalist, and he was a diplomat. He had been Secretary of the Navy, this just wonderful crusading journalist. No one in the 5 years I worked there ever mentioned that he was the leader of the white supremacy campaign in 1898, led the propaganda campaign for it. In fact, today, if you go on the UNC campus, the student stores are named the Josephus Daniels Student Stores. According to the student newspaper, there are almost 30 buildings on the UNC campus that are named for white supremacists, and many of these people were active in this campaign in 1898. And I bring this up just to make the point that this really isn't ancient history. I mean, it's about right now. That legacy is alive right now on the campus of the University of North Carolina. And in fact, I realized as I was researching this book that this story has been following me around for most of my adult life, and I finally got around to writing it. Now, the people who have read this book, as David mentioned, have two reactions. One is, how could I possibly not know about this? And two, how could this happen in the United States of America? And my answer in the book is that this was really a forgotten and buried chapter, not only of North Carolina history, but of American history, that was really covered up and mischaracterized for more than a century. And these events happened at a time when white supremacy essentially went unchallenged right up to the White House, as you'll find if you read the book. I'll just give you a quick overview. David covered some of it, of exactly what happened. In 1898, in November that year, white supremacists overthrew a multiracial government in the port city of Wilmington on the North Carolina coast, which at the time was the biggest city in North Carolina. They killed at least 60 black men and wounded dozens more. They burned down the black newspaper. They evicted city leaders at gunpoint, and they appointed themselves, the mob leaders, as mayor, police chief, sheriff, and city alderman. And they banished the black men they didn't kill, the black leaders, the lawyers and the doctors and the politicians. They put them on a banishment list along with white Republicans who had cooperated with black leadership. They marched them at gunpoint to the train station, put them on the train, and said, if you ever come back to Wilmington again, we will shoot you on sight. And not one of those people ever returned. Now you can imagine on the day of the coup and the massacre what it must have been like for black families as their men are being shot down in the streets. Of course, they were terrified, and they just took off from their homes trying to flee these white gunmen, and they fled to the swamps and the forests around the city. Some of them went to a black cemetery thinking maybe the white gunmen wouldn't come there. They spent 2 nights and 3 days out in the woods and the swamps and the cemetery, and this was November, and it was cold at night and it had been raining. There were some contemporary accounts that mentioned that at least one black child died of exposure during this time. And after 3 days, they felt that possibly it was safe enough to return to their homes just to have enough time to pack up their belongings and get out of town. And in the weeks and days and weeks after the coup and massacre, 2,100 black people fled Wilmington and never came back. For me, what's really hard to believe about this whole episode is that no one, not one person, was ever punished. No one was prosecuted, much less convicted for their role in 60 murders and a violent coup. It's also hard to believe that the white supremacists announced all of this way ahead of time, months ahead of time. They announced in public that they would overthrow, quote, what they called Negro rule by the ballot or the bullet or both. They said they were going to do it, and they did it while the whole country watched. Because they had announced this in the spring, summer, and fall of 1898, they actually called it the White Supremacy Campaign, if you can believe it. That was the name of it, in caps. Because they had announced it, it attracted attention from newspapers around the country. The New York Times, the Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, the Washington Evening Star, the Baltimore Sun, papers from Savannah and Atlanta and Charlotte. Obviously, the News and Observer, the papers in Wilmington. This thing got incredible coverage. And now when these white correspondents from mainly from these northern papers would show up in Wilmington at the train station, the white supremacists would meet them and hand out cigars and whiskey and arrange for their lodging. But they also, to use a modern term, they embedded them with the white gunmen who had set up patrols. They had turned the city into an armed camp with armed white men patrolling day and night, and they had set up checkpoints. So what they did would take the white correspondents out and fill them with the narrative of the white supremacists, which was that blacks were ignorant, venal, corrupt, they weren't capable of voting, and they certainly weren't capable of running government, and they had to be removed. And secondly, they told them that the blacks were stockpiling arms and were planning a black riot the day of the election and to take over Wilmington from the whites. And many of the newspapers, not all of them, they basically bought the narrative, and this is what they reported back to their readers in the North and the Northeast and in the Mid-Atlantic. So that was the story even before the coup and massacre that was presented to the public. And now for a century, what happened in Wilmington was called a race riot. It was not a race riot, it was a racial massacre. It was a planned murder spree. Wilmington really, there have been many other so-called race riots, as you know, in our history in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. And in many of these, it was a spontaneous outburst of white rage, often precipitated by allegations that a black man had raped a white woman. Wilmington was unique. It was a premeditated murder spree. It was planned in advance. It was not spontaneous at all. In fact, as David said earlier, it was the most successful permanent violent overthrow of an elected government in American history. There has never been anything like it before or since. People do ask me why Wilmington was such a threat to white supremacists. It was really a bold experiment for the time. Wilmington was really a rarity and an outlier for most southern cities at the time. For one thing, it had a black majority population. The black population was 56%. At that time, I believe New Orleans was 27% and Louisville was about 17%. But more importantly, they had a multiracial government, which was highly unusual at the time. You had black men in positions of power. In Wilmington, 10 of the 26 police officers were black. 3 of the 10 city aldermen were black. There were black magistrates, black lawyers and doctors. The county treasurer was black. The county jailer was black. The city coroner was black. And this was, as you can imagine, just intolerable to the white supremacists who were used to running things in Wilmington and in North Carolina, and they were not going to let it stand. Now, their main goal was not only to overthrow the multiracial government in Wilmington and to take back the state legislature. They had a much broader goal, and that was to prevent blacks ever again from voting and holding public office. And by those standards, what they accomplished was incredibly successful. In 1896, there were 126,000 registered black voters in North Carolina, 126,000. Just 6 years later, in 1902, the number was down to 6,000. So you can see how effective this was, and it actually went down from there. And in fact, blacks did not vote in any appreciable numbers in North Carolina for 70 more years, basically until after the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The coup also turned a black majority city into a white supremacist stronghold. As I said, in 1898, Wilmington was 56% black. Today, it's 18% black. As you can imagine, this was not a city where black people would be welcome. It was a very dangerous city for black people, and most of them fled who lived there, and very few were willing to move back in. In 1898, the United States of America had exactly one black member of Congress, just one. And he happened to be from North Carolina. His name was George Henry White. And he represented a district in southeastern North Carolina known as the Black Second, and it was adjacent to Wilmington, and he spent a lot of time in Wilmington. The white supremacists hounded him and his family. As a matter of fact, Josephus Daniels, the newspaper publisher in Raleigh, who called his newspaper the militant voice of white supremacy, actually used the N-word in an editorial and in news stories to describe Congressman White. And he finally was hounded so badly, they also really slandered his wife and his kids. He decided in 1900 that he wasn't going to run for re-election, and he gave a long, rueful interview to the New York Times, and he ended it by announcing that he was leaving and never coming back, and he said, "I cannot live in North Carolina and be treated like a man." After George Henry White left office in 1900, no black citizen served in Congress from North Carolina until 1992, almost a century later. And after those 3 black aldermen were evicted at gunpoint, no black citizen served on the Wilmington City Council until 1972, which wasn't that long ago. Now, the coup also installed white supremacy and Jim Crow as official state policy in North Carolina for almost 50 years. It also inspired white supremacists across the South. I'll give you one example. In 1906, there was a statewide election in Georgia, and the white supremacists there were trying to figure out a way to suppress the black vote and steal the election. So the first thing they did was consult the leaders of the Wilmington coup. And after this consultation, there was a man named Hoke Smith, a white supremacist who eventually ended up being elected governor in a stolen election. And his quote after meeting with the men from Wilmington was, quote, "We can handle the blacks the way they handled them in Wilmington, where the woods were black with their hanging carcasses." Now, the main weapon of the white supremacy campaign in North Carolina was a fake news campaign led by Josephus Daniels at the News and Observer, who planted phony stories about blacks to incite whites to attack blacks and intimidate them and keep them from voting. In 1898, though, almost a quarter of white voters were illiterate. So Daniels solved that problem by hiring a political cartoonist. And then he wrote and designed under Daniels' direction some incredibly racist cartoons. There's some of them reprinted in the book, but they were very effective in getting across the tenets of white supremacy to illiterate whites. It was very, very effective. I'd like to read just a brief passage in the book that describes Josephus Daniels and the other white newspapers and their white supremacy propaganda campaign. More than a century before sophisticated fake news attacks targeted social media websites, Daniels' manipulation of white readers through phony or misleading newspaper stories was perhaps the most daring and effective disinformation campaign of the era. The most sensational stories focused on what Daniels and other Democrats claimed was the, quote, black beast rapist. As a native of the South, Daniels understood implicitly the sexual insecurities of many white Southern males. Already emasculated by Union troops who had occupied their towns, they risked further shame if black men were elevated to something approaching equality. A black man who could vote or hold public office was a man who might, by their logic, become a rival for the affections of white women. With each cartoon and with each provocative article in the summer of 1898, Daniels pitted blacks against whites. The day was coming, Daniels wrote in the News and Observer, when white men, quote, will take the law in their own hands and by organized force make the Negroes behave themselves, end quote. A race war was inevitable. Quote, a clash is surely coming between the races, Daniels assured his readers, quote, and in such clashes the white race is always victorious. Now, white supremacists had their fake news, but they also had their own militia. And these were called red shirts, and they were basically white vigilantes. It was an outgrowth of the Klan, and in fact, many members of the red shirts were sons, grandsons, and nephews of Klansmen. And their job during the summer and fall of 1898 was to suppress the black vote. And what they would do was ride out at night into the Cape Fear countryside on horseback. They had Winchesters, shotguns, and pistols. They would barge into black homes, yank out black men, whip them, beat them, and tell them, if you dare to register to vote, we will come back and kill you. And as you can imagine, this had an incredible effect on suppressing the black vote. And on Election Day, which was in November of 1898, they intercepted black men who had found the courage to actually go out and try to vote. They intercepted quite a few and intimidated them and turned them away. Some blacks did vote, but the black vote was so suppressed that the white supremacists stole the election. They also sent the red shirts and other vigilantes into polling stations to knock over lamps, and in the darkness they would stuff ballot boxes with fake Democratic ballots and throw away the Republican ballots. And there were several precincts where the, quote, winning Democratic candidate got more votes than the total number of registered voters in the entire district. So you can see what was going on. Now, I should mention that during 1898, during the elections, these were for county, state, and federal office, but city offices, mayor and police chief and the city alderman didn't come up for election until the following March in 1899. So the white supremacist plan was to steal the election and then 2 days later, on November 10th, 1898, rise up with the coup and overthrow the city government. Now, in addition to the red shirts, the white supremacists also had two state militias in Wilmington. These were called the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Wilmington Naval Reserves. Now, these were state militias. They were the National Guard of the day, and they were supposed to report to the Republican governor in Raleigh. But in fact, they were commanded by white supremacists, and almost every member was a white supremacist. So they reported to the coup leaders. During the summer, the white merchants of Wilmington raised $10,000 to buy the newest and most lethal early version of a machine gun that had been invented at this time. It was called a Colt rapid-fire gun. It could fire 420 rounds a minute. And to intimidate the black leadership, they took black leaders in the summer of 1898, they took them out to an island in the Cape Fear River and demonstrated the gun by firing into a riverbank just to intimidate the leadership, and it worked because it was a very impressive display. Now, many of you know that the summer of 1898 was the year that the Spanish-American War was fought. And these white militiamen were called up into federal service to serve in the Spanish-American War. But the coup leaders made sure that by the day of the coup, they were back in Wilmington and ready to be unleashed on the black population. Now, on the day of the coup, they were still in federal service. They wouldn't be mustered out for probably another 8 or 10 days. And that meant that federal soldiers murdered American citizens in cold blood and got away with it. Now, black soldiers also served in the Spanish-American War in segregated units, and they too were, the units from Wilmington were called up to serve in the war. But the leaders of the coup made sure that they were not back in town by the day of the coup. They kept them on a training base in Georgia, hundreds of miles away. So that meant the black community was defenseless on the day of the coup. All these young men trained as soldiers, trained in weapons, were unavailable. Now there was, many defenders of the black community, and one of them was a man named Alex Manley, who was a publisher of the Daily Record, which was the black readership newspaper in Wilmington, and their banner claimed that it was the only Negro daily in the world. I don't think it was, but it was one of the few, and it was a very powerful voice for the black community. And as a journalist, I was really, really drawn to Manley. He was just a fascinating character and a very courageous man. He challenged whites in print and demanded civil rights for black citizens. He also addressed the federal government and demanded that it live up to its promises to the freed slaves under the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and to provide the equal rights under law that they were promised. He wrote an expose of horrible conditions in the colored ward of the city hospital and got improvements there, and he got improvements in sanitation for black neighborhoods. In August of 1898, this was several months before the election, he wrote an incendiary editorial about race and sex that almost got him lynched. Now, this editorial was in response to a speech that had been given by a woman named Rebecca Felton, a well-known woman at the time down in Georgia. And in this speech, she said the solution to this supposed epidemic of rapes of white women by black men was the lynch rope. And her quote during the speech was, "I say lynch 1,000 times a week if necessary." Alex Manley read this because it was immediately published in the Wilmington newspapers, in the white papers. He saw it. He immediately responded with an editorial. And it absolutely shocked white people in Wilmington and in North Carolina and across the South because it was immediately reprinted across the South. In the editorial, he wrote that many black men lynched for supposedly raping white women were in fact their consensual lovers. And he also pointed out that white men raped black women with impunity. I'd like to read just a short passage from his editorial, which was pretty long, by the way, but I'm just going to read a few lines. And in it, he's addressing the white community. Quote, "Every Negro lynched is called a, quote, big, burly, black brute, when in fact many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers and were not only black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is very well known to all. Let virtue be something more than an excuse for them to intimidate and torture a helpless people. Tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites in that you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours." Now, as you can imagine, that did not go over well with the white community. And in fact, the red shirts mounted up and wanted to lynch Manley that day. And just to show you how premeditated and calculated this coup was, the white leadership intercepted them and said, "No, this is too early. We'll have a much better political impact, and we can use this closer to the election in November." So they held off, but they also promised him, "I promise you, in November, you can lynch Manley and you can burn his newspaper." Well, I lost my place here. Hold on. I also want to read two short passages that show basically the scope of the tragedy. And the first is an election eve speech given to the red shirts by a man named Colonel Alfred Moore Waddell. He was a former U.S. congressman, Confederate soldier, and newspaperman who actually led the mob on the day of the coup and installed himself as mayor, by the way. And this speech, again, was the night before the election. He's speaking to at least 1,000 white men, many of them red shirts, at Thalian Hall, which still exists today in downtown Wilmington, which is the main public building there, and is where the city hall was. Again, the speech the night before the election. Quote, and this is Waddell speaking, quote, "The crisis is upon us. You must do your duty. This city, county, and state shall be rid of Negro domination once and forever. You have the courage. You are brave. You are the sons of noble ancestry. You are Anglo-Saxons. You are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks. To show you how the red shirts and the mobs responded, I'll read you a very short passage. This is in the opening couple of hours after gunfire breaks out and the white mobs start shooting black men in the streets. And it begins with a reporter from the white supremacist newspaper in Wilmington. His name's Thomas Clausen. Thomas Clausen, the white reporter, followed a wounded black man from North 4th and Harnett Streets into a home at 411 Harnett Street. He encountered 3 distraught black women. On the floor behind them was a black man named Bezell, dead of his wounds. On a bed, Clausen found the owner of the house, George H. Davis, also a black man, bleeding from a gunshot wound to the chest just above his heart, and another wound to his left thigh. An embedded bullet was visible just beneath the skin of the man's chest. Clausen ran his finger over it. Davis opened his eyes and told Clausen that the white men had fired first. Before returning to his reporting on the street, Clausen sent for both a white doctor and a black doctor to tend to the wounded man. Davis survived, though Clausen later remarked that, quote, it appeared impossible for one so desperately wounded ever to recover, close quote. And now this is a couple paragraphs later. A city ambulance bearing a white cross bounced through the rutted streets, collecting the wounded, both black and white. 14 bleeding men, 12 black, and 2 of the 3 whites who had been shot were delivered to Wilmington City County Hospital. The hospital was understaffed. Many of the white nurses and medical assistants had fled, fearing they would be shot by black rioters. The white resident on call, Dr. R.E. Zachary, treated the patients, the whites in the white ward, the blacks in the colored ward. 2 of the black men died just after they were admitted. Every other patient survived. Dr. Zachary made a notation, quote, all except the 2 white men were shot in the back. Now, you would think that an event like this that had such major ramifications would be described at length in North Carolina's public school history books, but in fact, it was barely mentioned. And when it was mentioned, it was portrayed as a heroic white response to a black race riot and, quote, a good government effort to replace a corrupt, quote, Negro rule and Negro domination. Let me read just from a public school textbook from North Carolina from 1933, and all these are in the book. Again, 1933, public school textbook in North Carolina. Quote, there were many Negro office holders, some of whom were poorly fitted for their tasks. This naturally aroused ill feelings between the races. Here's a public school textbook in North Carolina from 1940. Quote, the mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep their vote, the carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. The worst crimes were not punished. The white people of the South were no longer safe, close quote. And this is from a 1949 public school textbook. Quote, a number of blacks were jailed for starting a riot, and a new white administration took over Wilmington's government, end quote. And finally, this is from a 1940 textbook about why the KKK and the red shirts were so necessary. Again, this is a public school textbook that was taught to school children in 1940. Quote, to put an end to this terrible condition, white people joined together in a sort of club, which they named the Ku Klux Klan. Members dressed as ghosts and scared lawless men into acting decently. On moonlit nights, these men could be seen on horseback, riding to bring order back into the lives of their people. Such sights frightened Negroes into living better lives. The names of these men, Negro or white, who had done wrong were listed. The next moonlit night, the Klan would visit these men and punish them according to the wrongs they had done. After this, lawless men were not so bold, and crime became less and less. So you can see from reading just the school textbooks that the white mythology just kept this false narrative alive for years and years, for, as I said before, well over a century. And I wrote this book in part because I wanted to correct the historical record. I truly believe that we do have to confront the ugliest chapters of our history to understand the roots of racism and hate and to learn from it. Today, politicians and demagogues are using social media rather than newspapers to scapegoat and demonize people of color, especially with white nationalism on the rise. As I was reading this book, the events in Charlottesville, and I believe it was the summer of 2017, broke out. And it occurred to me those very fine people who were marching with torches and chanting, "Jews will not replace us," would have felt right at home in Wilmington in 1898. Now, politicians and extremists today are not nearly as openly and nakedly racist as the whites were in 1898, but they're still playing on those same fears and hates and resentments. And the underlying message from some of these people is that America is a white country, and people of color are portrayed as outsiders and threats to the traditional American way of life. And indeed, some of these politicians are using some of the same tactics as in 1898. I really hear the echoes of 1898 and what I hear on Twitter and social media today. Just a couple examples. Alex Manley, the newspaper publisher, in addition to many, many death threats and nearly being lynched, was told many times to go back to Africa. Well, just this summer, 3 congresswomen of color in the United States were told to, quote, go back to their home countries. So you see this same scapegoating and demonizing coming out. Another example, as I mentioned, in 1898, whites were told that blacks were raping their women and stealing their jobs. In 2015, a certain politician rode down an escalator to announce his run for president, and he said Mexican criminals and rapists, he used the word rapists, Mexican criminals and rapists were pouring across the border to steal American jobs. This kind of incitement and scapegoating really can have consequences, even if they aren't as devastating as they were in 1898. I'll give you one example. This summer, our president was warning of a, quote, border invasion across the Mexican border, border invasion of Hispanics. And in August, a white gunman targeted Hispanics at a Walmart in El Paso, and he killed 22 Hispanic men. And later, he told police he wanted to stop, quote, a border invasion. You obviously cannot prove that the incitement on Twitter led to this act, but there certainly today is an atmosphere of incitement and hate and demonization that was very much alive in 1898. So I believe if we do not learn from tragedies like Wilmington, demagogues and bigots can play the race card again and again to incite the sort of hate and violence that was so destructive 122 years ago. So if there's one thing I hope people do take from this book, that's it. So thank you so much for listening so patiently. You've been a great audience. I appreciate it. And thank you. And we will open it up for questions and answers. And I believe there will be a mic available on each step. So any comments, complaints, anything?
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for your book. I just finished it this morning, with the exception of the epilogue. Yeah, okay. But I'm from New York City. Right. But I'm from New York City because of the Great American Migration. My grandmother was born in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1916. My mother was born in 1937. Nana left in 47. Mom left in 52, both for Harlem. I would go down to Wilmington for summer reunions with my family as a young boy. And just a week and a half ago, I'm sitting with my mother, who's 83, telling her about this book that I'm reading, and she is utterly astonished. She has no idea about this event that took place, 18 years before her mother was born. Right. And so I am now a pastor, and I actually am going to Wilmington this weekend to speak to a group of churches and ministry leaders about racial reconciliation in the city. And so my question for you is, if you had the opportunity to speak into that kind of circumstance, or to those folks in Wilmington now about the issue of reconciliation around the issues of race, what would you want to communicate to them about the history of their city and the way to kind of move forward? So thank you.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for that info. That was a great story. I wish I had met you when I was researching my book. I was in Wilmington 2 weeks ago at a book event at the public library, and they put me up on the third floor in a room with 50 chairs. And 350 people showed up. Not surprisingly, Wilmington's in the title. So I don't know what they were thinking. I mean, if there's one city in the world where somebody might show up to hear an author talk about this book, it would be Wilmington. But they had to turn away about 100 people because of the fire marshal wouldn't let them in. But their questions were amazing, and it was all about reconciliation. In 1998, the University of North Carolina at Wilmington put together a whole bunch of events over a period of months trying to bring the white descendants and the black descendants together to talk about, first of all, how we were going to tell the true story, not the false story, and how we can come together in the future. And of course, one of the things that came up was reparations. And that, after they had gotten everybody together, once that came up, it started pulling people apart because there were many white people who were furious at it, and many African Americans who thought that was the only way we could reconcile. When I gave my talk, which was sponsored by the NAACP, even so, I was waiting for people, white people from Wilmington, to come up and say, why are you stirring up this racial hatred? This is old and dead, let's let it pass. I didn't hear any of that, but I heard incredible stories, really heartbreaking, painful stories from the black residents. I don't know that I'm qualified to give them any advice at all. They know the story and they know what happened, but I would say try to openly address what happened. Do it openly and honestly, and tell your story on both sides, because you didn't get to the epilogue, but I talked to descendants on both sides and got some fascinating interviews of people who had actually talked to each other and reached in some cases, a form of reconciliation. So I hope that answers your question. It was kind of a long-winded answer, but yes, anybody else?
My question is that for people who are from the North and who've had folks from the North in the Civil War,
Right.
the past, when you go down to the South and you see communities, you just kind of feel like, I don't know, you just feel like these African Americans, they're captured, you know, and I can't help but feel like how many other communities have been captured. So this story took 100 years to get out. So the story of peonage in Tennessee and Alabama, you know, and you just. It's kind of hard to explain, but when you come from the North, you know, when you've had folks from the North, from the Civil War, and it becomes, and it makes you feel kind of sad. It makes you just feel like, why don't you want to know the true story? Why don't you want to reveal, you know, and I know it has all to do with who runs the economy,
Right.
of course. But I think that your book is one way in which we can bring this out to say that it's important to realize when you're captured and when you're supporting incorrect views that are actually damaging to your own people in the long run. You just don't see the full story. You're, you know, living in a cloud and you don't see the clearness that it's actually maybe not as helpful.
Right.
Yeah, so I don't know if you could address that.
Yeah. Well, as many of you know, it wasn't only Wilmington. This was going on across the South. The so-called redeemers after Reconstruction, the white supremacists, redeemed North Carolina and the rest of the South for white supremacy. And so there were a lot of buried incidents all across the South. The problem is the whites control the narrative. And they've controlled it all these years, and these are very painful episodes. The white descendants are embarrassed, some of them, are quite embarrassed. They don't want to go back into it. And for African Americans, I can't speak for them, but it must be terrifically painful to go back through this, but I think we have to. I'll tell you briefly, there was a man named Lewin Manley Jr., who was the great-grandson of Alex Manley, the black publisher. And he spent the first few years of his life, when he was a very, very young child, with his grandfather before he died, and then he lived with his grandmother, Alex Manley's wife, and with her sisters, his aunts, his great-aunts. His whole life growing up, he had this sense that something terrible had befallen his grandfather. And he asked the family, he asked his own father, Alex Manley's son, he asked all his relatives, nobody would talk about it. They said, we just do not talk about that. And I've talked to other families who said the same thing, it's just too painful. And Lewin Manley didn't find out about it until 2006, when a state commission in North Carolina spent 5 years investigating the events and came up with the true story. And he read that and he was astonished. But he still had this fear in his heart and this sadness that he grew up, knew his grandfather, and never knew what happened. I hope that answers the question. Yes, sir.
A couple of points. I'm reading your book. I'm nearly finished. It's an incredible eye-opener. A couple of points. One, I was surprised to see that when the white supremacists launched their coup, it wasn't just directed against the Republicans and the black voters. It was also directed against populists.
Yes.
So there was, I think, what you call a fusion between those elements. And I always was raised to think the populists were white racists, but this thing may be very much an exception. So I was wondering if you could explain how that happened.
Yes.
And then secondly, following up on what you just alluded to, this commission from the state that took 5 years to come up with a story. How did that even start? Who came up with the idea that this is something that really needs to be looked into?
Right. Okay, first question was about
The populists. How did the
Okay.
North Carolina
Yes.
populists differ so much
Yes.
from the rest of the southern populists?
In the early 1890s, the Populist Party was made up mostly of poor white farmers, and they had aligned themselves with the Democrats, which everyone knows the Democrats then were the party of white supremacy, and the Republicans were the party of Lincoln and black voting. They had aligned themselves with the Democrats, but there was a terrible recession in the early 1890s, and crop prices collapsed, and the white populists became disillusioned with the Democrats because they had aligned themselves with big moneyed interests like banks and railroads, and the populists felt they weren't addressing bread and butter issues like jobs and education for their kids. So they made the decision, even though they were probably as racist as the white supremacists in the Democratic Party, to align themselves with the Republican Party, which meant they aligned themselves with black voters. But they came together in something called fusion, which was the Populist Party and the Republican Party, and they took over the state legislature in 1894, and then they took over the city government in Wilmington. And then there was this sort of uneasy cooperation and unity between blacks and whites. So that's how that came about. And the second part of the question was the commission. The state commission came about because there were two black state legislators from Wilmington who got a bill passed in the state legislature to say it is time to tell the true story of what happened. It's been 100 years. So they appointed a state commission which had blacks and whites on it, historians and scholars. They spent 5 years really digging into it. They published a 460-page report which told the true story, came to the conclusion that this was a racial, premeditated coup, an overthrow of a government, and they talk about the ramifications on black voting and black progress, and it turned Wilmington into a white majority city and set Jim Crow on the way, and all of this. So that is how that came about. And by the way, as a resource, that was fantastic for me. I'm not a trained historian, I'm a journalist, but I could follow, they cited all of their sources, so I could go back and go to their original sources. Who is next? On this side, I think.
Hi. I was wondering if you could talk about how the process of researching and writing this book has been different than some of the other things you've worked on. I know that you have
Right.
A lot of international and contemporary journalism
Good
background.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, as I say, I'm a journalist. I'm used to interviewing people who have witnessed events, recent events normally, and in most cases I've witnessed it myself. And this was completely new and foreign to me to try to piece together in a narrative way something that happened 120 some years ago. And this book is entirely built on pieces of paper, on documents, on letters, diaries, memoirs, and particularly newspapers, because this was so well covered. One incredible story to me as a journalist, the Washington Evening Star reporter in Wilmington covered the early part of the riot, the coup, which started at about 11 o'clock. He filed his story by telegram, sent it to Washington. It was in the evening paper that same day, just hours away. It was like immediate news. But I'm getting away from your question, but it's just an example of just how thoroughly and well covered this was. So there's plenty of information out there, but it's very time consuming. But what was pretty interesting for me was going into the archives where you put on the white gloves and you can't take a pen or a pencil or anything in there, and you hold the actual, the documents from the time, which to me was pretty exciting. So I hope that answered your question.
Hi, I enjoyed your presentation. Did the president at the time, who I believe was McKinley, who would have been supported by African Americans, try to do anything to ameliorate the situation?
Yeah, there's a whole chapter in the book about William McKinley, which was very surprising to me because he was an abolitionist. He was a Union officer. He gave a speech at the 1888 Republican Convention alerting people that these white redeemers across the South were suppressing the black vote and attacking and intimidating blacks. So you would think he would have been quite supportive. In the weeks and months leading up to the coup, he was visited in the White House by George Henry White, the congressman from North Carolina, and told explicitly that they are going to take over, they're going to kill people, they are going to take over the government, not only in Wilmington, but in Raleigh. And I'm warning you, you need to do something about it. A delegation of black ministers from Washington, D.C. went to see McKinley, told him the same thing. After the coup, the same thing happened. George Henry White and the ministers all went to McKinley and begged him to do something, send troops, intercede, punish these people, get up a grand jury. He did nothing. I could find nothing in the historical record anywhere that he ever mentioned Wilmington in public once. Now, I did find accounts of cabinet meetings where it came up, but he personally never said anything about it. You have to remember this was during the Spanish-American War, and during the summer and fall, the negotiations with Spain were going very badly, and he was being criticized for the way his administration was handling it. And also, U.S. troops in Cuba and Puerto Rico were dying of yellow fever, and he was being hammered by Congress for not getting the proper sanitation facilities and proper food and proper care of the troops. So he had a lot going on, a lot on his mind. But as you mentioned, he was put into office largely with the black vote. I mean, it was a huge part of what put him in office. But he was also running for re-election. And I think, I'm just guessing, he made a political calculation. First of all, he did not want to antagonize whites not only in North Carolina, but white voters across the South because he needed them. And I believe he figured out, as everyone knew, the black vote by then had been completely suppressed, so he wasn't going to get the black vote he had gotten when he ran before. And I think because of all that, he did nothing. Was it this side?
Thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. Did you find historically anything analogous between this crisis that occurred and the riots in Oklahoma in 1921, I believe it was? And if so, please explain.
Yeah. I'm certainly not an expert on the Tulsa riots in 1921. It was quite a bit different. As I say, Wilmington was premeditated and planned. From what I know about Tulsa, there was a little bit of planning, and I think they were looking for a spark. I mean, they were kind of ready. And the whites were deeply offended because there was a very prosperous black middle class in a black business area. I believe the precipitating cause was an alleged attack by a black man on a white woman. And as you know, they burned the whole black section of the city, and I don't know how many people they killed. I think it was more than 60. So those are the comparison between those two events. But as I said, there have been many other so-called race riots in our history. Yes, sir.
Yes, thank you very much for your really important book. My question moves a little bit away from historical facts, the facts that you present, but I can tell from listening to you, I think, that you've gone really deeply into this subject. And I would like to take advantage of your probably talking to hundreds of people and your scholarship and your journalistic skills. Do you have you learned anything from this process that might help us think about reparations? This is a personal question. Do you have a personal take on reparations from having done this work that you would be willing to share with us?
Yeah, I personally think it's a hugely legitimate question and an important question. I don't know, though, how you go about compensating people whose families over 3 generations were just ripped apart, their whole lives were ripped apart. How do you compensate them? I think a nice way to start would be not to remove the pre-clearance clause in the Voting Rights Act, like recently happened, which allowed North Carolina to come up with their voter ID bill. But reparations, I said, came up in Wilmington. It was a very divisive issue. I would certainly be in favor of it. I just wonder in today's political climate how you could ever get that through a state legislature, much less through Congress. I don't know, but I think it's a really valid subject that we really need to talk about.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Okay.
I too want to thank you for your book, and I definitely will purchase it. I'm from Newark, New Jersey, but I went to college in Raleigh, North Carolina at Shore University from '66 to '70. A lot of kids were, from various places, including Wilmington. I'm just astounded, that no one ever mentioned it. Mm-hmm. But given today's climate, there in the black community is a lot of fear. And it's fear because we were, with the election of Trump, were astounded that at least 40% of the voting public would support someone like Trump. And there's distrust in our community that that the United States is an armed camp now, as it relates to the white population. We don't have that many guns in the black community, except for some young kids shooting each other. And we just don't know what the rest of the country would do if something happened, or whether we could trust the military. So reflecting upon that, I could see probably why we didn't hear about it, because even as a child, I used to go to my grandparents' house in Georgia, but they would hear stories about black leaders who were just assassinated, for stepping forward. Right. And I think that fear continues right on through my generation now. So anyway, I appreciate what you've done, but what, in terms of the commission was the University of North Carolina doing to address maybe some of these? You said there are about 30 buildings,
almost 30,
named for white supremacists.
Yeah.
And have you had the opportunity to speak to them about that? And are they inquiring?
It's a huge issue down there, as it is across the South with all these Confederate monuments. Mm-hmm. I don't want to go into any great detail. There's a monument called Silent Sam on the UNC campus, which was supposedly put up in 1913 to honor the white students from the school fought in the Confederacy. It was actually a tribute to white supremacy. It has a direct connection to the white supremacy campaign because the financial supporter of the white supremacy campaign gave the dedication speech. He's a man named Julius Shakespeare Carr. of American Tobacco and Bull Durham Tobacco. He gave the speech and didn't talk about the guys serving in the war. They talked about how they had saved North Carolina for white supremacy, had saved it for the Anglo-Saxon race. And to your earlier point, I can certainly understand, and I felt this very deeply as I was reading this book, why young black men today in particular might be a little leery of white police officers in uniform giving these videos you constantly see of these attacks on unarmed black men, when in 1898 you had federal soldiers mowing down and killing black men in the streets. I forgot the last part of your question. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Well, had you had the opportunity to address this with this individual at the University of North Carolina?
At the University of North Carolina, I went to school at a building called Saunders Hall. William Saunders was the head of the KKK in North Carolina. They named a building after him. There were years of protests. In 2015, the school renamed it Carolina Hall. And I mentioned Kenan Stadium before. This is interesting. William Rand Kenan Jr., who was not even born at the time of the riot, became a rich industrialist, and he's given millions and millions to the University of North Carolina. He gave it for the stadium in honor of his father, who was the machine gunner in Wilmington. And I talked to a reporter from the student newspaper a couple of years ago and told her about this. She wrote a story about it. It created a huge uproar. The university immediately renamed it. Didn't rename the stadium. They renamed it Kenan Jr. They named it after the junior, but it's still Kenan Stadium, but it's no longer named after the white supremacists. But this whole Silent Sam issue is huge. Students in 2018, there had been all these clashes between students and neo-Confederate groups over the statue. They tore it down. They put it in storage, and the university tried to figure out what to do with it. It caused the resignation or firing of the chancellor over this issue. The day before Thanksgiving, just this past Thanksgiving, the Board of Governors of the university cut a secret deal with the sons of Confederate veterans who had no standing in court, didn't own the statue. They gave them $2.5 million. They said, you can have this statue, you can display it wherever you want on private property as long as it's not in one of the 14 counties that has a UNC campus on it. In addition, they gave them $74,999 to promise not to parade on campus anymore. And the reason it was that amount, if it was $75,000, they had to report it to the state attorney general. They did this in secret. They announced it at the dead hour, which was 5 p.m. on the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, hoping nobody would notice. The next Monday, the whole state erupted. All the students and the faculty at UNC rebelled. Lawsuits were filed. Donors stopped giving money to the university. Now it's tied up in court. But as you can see, this legacy is still very much alive today. And that's what the university is dealing with. And these buildings are still up there, most of them.
Thank you.
Thank you.